Hi everyone, I'm Yong Su Kim and I currently work at Google, but I don't want to talk about Google. I want to talk about a couple of things first. So let me start out with Oracle. So my first job after college and grad school was Oracle. And for those of you who don't know, Oracle is a large software company. It's a very successful company. And I want to talk about two executives at Oracle. Ray Lane, who's the older gentleman on your left there, and then Gary Bloom. Ray Lane ran all of sales, and Gary Bloom ran all of product. So one guy made the thing, the other guy sold it. And I had attended a workshop, a leadership workshop, where these two people came and spoke. And Ray Lane talked about his leadership journey, and essentially it boiled down to, I have this ability to walk into a room, I have the ability to kind of like convince people that my point of view is the right point of view, and that's kind of my leadership style. And he was right, he really had it. It was just something he was born with, and he talked about a successful career. Gary Bloom came and talked about something very different. He basically said, I was never really that smart, I didn't go to top school, career was okay, but basically everything I know, I learned from failure and bad people management that I was exposed to. So he basically learned from failure and all the bad managers that he had. So I want to do something similar to Gary Bloom. So I want to talk about, kind of from my perspective, before I joined Google, I was an entrepreneur. And more specifically, I was a failed entrepreneur. So I failed. So what I want to do is talk about my failure and some of the things I experienced and learned in the hope that you kind of have a better understanding of what it's like to run a startup, to fail, and kind of what you learn from it. So let me start out with my career path. So I wasn't always a failed entrepreneur. I actually had a pretty good career. So after getting my computer science degree at Columbia, getting my master's in computer science, as I said, I joined Oracle, had a pretty decent career. I joined a startup in New York, worked there for a couple of years, did a lot of interesting things, and worked at a company called WebEx. And WebEx, for you guys who don't know, it's basically an online kind of meeting company where you can hold meetings, business meetings over the internet. And I was working in the CTO office. So it was a very good career. And then essentially what happened was I got bored. So it was a linear progression. I knew what was going to happen. You do this, you get that. So I had this bright idea, like I wanted to adjust the curve, Just want to have this hockey stick. So anyone who's been involved in any startup or kind of has any business plan, you know this chart. Everyone draws this chart. They start out thinking, I have an idea, I have a couple of concepts I want to build out, and I'm going to have projections in terms of users, revenue, that all look like this. You basically start low, and then you pick up momentum. And if you don't have this chart, when you go talk to investors, they basically turn you down. But really, if you're thinking of doing a startup, this is the chart you need to think about, the red line there. It's actually the reverse. And by the way, this is kind of a proxy for my net worth after I started my startup, right? So you basically start at the top, and then you kind of lose money, and then you kind of stabilize. You figure out how to live with very little money, basically, right? So that's what happens. And really, they say at a startup, basically people talk about how if you do something you love so much, you would essentially do it for free, right? That's how you know that you love it so much. That's what a startup is, because you will be doing it for free. You will not be paid for the first year, first two. You will actually be losing money. So think about that before you go into a startup, right? And be prepared, basically, to think about that curve from a personal perspective, right? So ultimately, I went through this curve, kind of stabilized and figured out how to get by, but it ultimately failed, right? So I shut the thing down. So I was thinking about this talk and thought, what am I going to talk about? And I thought I'd talk about failure. And then I asked my daughter, she's 8 years old, So I said, I'm going to talk about failure. Is there such thing as good or bad failure? And she said, of course, it's easy. What's a good failure? A good failure is if you learn something from the experience, right? And a bad failure is if you don't. Duh, Daddy, right? 8 years old, right? So I thought, okay, so what did I learn after going through this experience? And then I came across this slide here, which is basically, Paul Graham is a person who started Y Combinator. It's an incubator for startups. He brings in entrepreneurs, typically people with a lot of experience, provides them with services. And he's gone through a lot of startups. And he writes these fantastic essays on the web. I suggest you look it up. And he listed 18 mistakes that kill startups. So basically, these are 18 mistakes that startups make when they get started and why they die. And then I looked through this list and I thought, how many mistakes did I make? And those are the ones in red. So I was a single founder. I didn't have multiple founders. That's mistake number one. There's a little story behind this. So when I was starting my company, I worked at WebEx, and I worked for the founder, Min Zhu, very successful entrepreneur, exited with a lot of money, basically, and I said, I'm going to start a company. And then he had advice for me. He said, starting a company and finding a founder is like getting married. So your co-founders are like your spouse or spouses. And then he said that startup is basically like your baby, right? So think about it. I'm a single parent in my startup, so it makes it much harder. So that's one mistake. And then he told me something which is funny too. He said, but VCs are like step-parents. So basically, you and your founders have this child. You're very proud of it. You're going to nurture it. But he said VCs will come in, and they'll act like step-parents. So if the child does really well, they'll love it. They'll be like proud of it. But if the child doesn't behave and doesn't do well, then they'll be like, oh, that's not my child anyway. So that's why I started with a single founder and didn't raise any money. And then a couple other ideas, bad location. I did it in Korea and in Palo Alto. And in retrospect, having one centralized team, one location would have been better. As a derivative idea, some of the ideas are things that people had tried. Obstinacy, I was stubborn. I stuck with it for 4 years, thinking I had the right idea. Took a long time to launch. No big use, spending too much money, et cetera, et cetera. And at first, I didn't actually get hands-on, but I figured out later on that you had to get hands-on. So I rebuilt everything. And so these are the kind of mistakes that you can pinpoint to about why you failed in that specific instance. So that's kind of one lesson you can learn about failure. Specific things that you should have done that you didn't do, that now next time you do it, you'll basically make less mistakes. You'll have less errors. So that's one kind of learning I got out of the experience. The other way to thinking about it is it was a really expensive education, right? So remember that chart that I showed you where you're spending money, you have an opportunity cost, because if I was working at that time, I'd be making money. But think about it as an expensive education, and it's a comprehensive education. So we all are willing to spend, 4 years, 6 years, 10 years. Yet think of a startup in that way as well. So what do you learn? It's essentially getting like a PhD in whatever area you're in. It's like getting an MBA. You learn about business. You learn about what it's like to deal with legal issues. You get a JD. You learn a lot about financial issues. Trust me, you will understand cash flows once you're doing a startup, right? Money coming in, money coming out, how much money that's left. You'll also pick up, the typical degrees. And you get to do everything at a startup. So you are the CEO. Even if you're not the CEO founder, you will learn what it's like being a CEO. You will learn how to do sales, marketing, PR, development support, finance, legal, HR, everything. It is about the best education that you can get in what it's like to actually be a senior executive, right? So if you're thinking of yourself as a future kind of CEO, you know what? Do a startup. You will be a CEO. You might fail, but you'll learn a lot. And whatever path you take afterwards, you'll be very well prepared for that. So think of it as a very expensive education, but something that is priceless in what you can get, right? The other thing that you kind of learn about yourself is basically you become more self-aware, right? So you develop a couple of things. So you learn what accountability really means. So if you work at a large company and you work on your job, someone doesn't do their job, it doesn't matter. You did your job, and you feel like, wow, I really did my job and added value to the company. If I'm in sales and marketing isn't doing that well, you can blame them, et cetera. At a startup, you are 100% accountable, right? You are the person in charge of whatever area, and if you don't deliver, everyone sinks. So you really understand what it means to be accountable. So let me tell you a story, and I don't want to bash MBAs, but I will bash this one, okay? So I attended a talk from Randy Komisar. He basically started a number of companies. And he talked about how a startup was a visceral experience. You felt it, You weren't really a startup person unless you're the CEO, you're running out of money, and you have to pay these people, and you have no money to pay them, and you get this feeling in your gut, and you're like, oh my God, it's the end of the world. But you feel accountable and responsible. So after he said that, an MBA student raised their hand and said, do you really have to go through that? Is that something you can learn? Kind of like take a course. Can I learn from you? And his point was, no, you have to experience this. And he's right. There's nothing like hearing me talk about it, hearing someone else, reading about it, and going through yourself. It's quite an experience. You really understand what accountability means. You learn a lot about leadership, right? You're leading a group of people. And leadership, there are various cuts of it, but essentially you're trying to get a group of people from point A to point B, and you're telling them this is the way you go, and people follow you. right? That's what you do at a startup. You do it with your employees, you do it with your investors, you do it with your partners, and you do it with your consumers. You say, this is a better way of sharing information on the web. Come with me. You're showing leadership there. The other thing is you learn confidence, and you learn confidence from failure. Well, at least I learned enough confidence to talk about failure in front of you guys, right? But this is an important thing. You'd be surprised. If you fail, you actually don't lose confidence, you gain confidence. How much worse could it be, right? Think of it that way. The other thing that was kind of an interesting byproduct that I never thought about was you learn all those things about what you should have done with your particular startup. You learn all these kind of soft skills about yourself. But you also really learn a lot of new things that you didn't anticipate. So speaking of my journey that I went through, I showed you the red graph where my net worth is going down, everything's kind of going to hell. But at the same time, you start gaining things. So in my particular case, what I gained was I learned a lot about what it's like to run a small business. I was a small business, right? I knew all the issues that I talked about in terms of meeting payroll. I learned about how to promote a small business, how to do online marketing. I learned what it's like to do sales. I understood social media because I actually built the applications, tried to get people to use it. So you learn a lot of things. And I learned a lot about analytics because I was analyzing my traffic. So interesting enough, what this enabled me to do is basically find my next opportunity. So what happened was I had done the startup, I'd learned all these things, and then I got an opportunity to interview at Google, and it turned out that there was a perfect role for me. I could leverage all the skills that I had developed, all the knowledge about small businesses, and all the different areas of kind of expertise that I'd built up, and that's what essentially led me to Google. So really, if you think about failure, it's not kind of an end destination by itself. It's always the path to something else in life. So think about that. The other thing I want to talk about is kind of the final thought I want to leave you with is, look, a lot of us think that our careers and our success is going from A to B, right? You go to school, you get your degree, you get your first job, you get promoted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not really. There is no certainty of going A to B in life. The only certainty in life is from B to D, basically birth to death. That is the only certainty in life. Everything that happens in between, that is life. Think about that, right? So everything that happens, and it's not a linear process. It is a messy, tangled thing. Tomorrow you fail, the other day you succeed, you go back and forth, something happens. It doesn't really matter. There are two certainties in life. We're all born and we all die. Everything else in between is life. So enjoy it, right? Learn from it. Iterate. Don't think it's the end. Don't think it's the start. It's always a continual process. So that's kind of the final thought I want to leave you with. And then I want to just leave with, kind of end the story with another example from Oracle. So here's another Oracle executive. So this person had a phenomenal rise at Oracle. Basically, in his early 20s, he was a VP. He basically started early, rose to the top, became VP, and then he started working on a couple of initiatives. So he worked on this Oracle Power Object. So it was like Oracle's version of Microsoft Visual Basic for those people who are technical, right? So he came with that product, failed, right? And then he had a good idea. He said, Oracle should create its own web browser. This is when Netscape was around, and they were kind of just, so he created Oracle Power Browser. Totally failed. How many people have heard of Oracle Power Browser, right? There you go, so total failure. And then he's had this idea of like, well, we should take all this multimedia, put it inside a database, and expose that as a file system. Total failure. I know because I try to get partners to use this thing, right? Total failure. In fact, his last job at Oracle was running Oracle Promise. He was so bad at his job that he was in charge of giving Oracle's money away to charities. That's what he was doing, Oracle Promise. He was giving money away, right? Negative value, well, although positive value on the charity side, right? So what did this person do? He left. And then he started a company called Salesforce.com, right? And now he's a billionaire philanthropist, right? Basically, he had a meteoric rise, learned from failure, left the company, found a new environment, and had a tremendous success. So the last thought I want to leave you with is, don't fear failure. It's a path onto something called life. It might lead you to somewhere bad, somewhere good, but that's okay, because it will lead you somewhere where you'll be in a better place. So don't be afraid of failure. I want everyone to go out today thinking about that and think, what can I try? Go try to fail at something. Fail at something really hard. Who knows, you might even succeed. Thank you.